Criada na década de 40, durante a Segunda Guerra Mundial, a mais famosa agência de espionagem do mundo chega ao século XXI com uma coleção de erros e fracassos muito mais letal, extensa e grave do que a de seus acertos no combate ao nazismo. Distorcer os fatos, disseminar falsas informações, corromper, enfraquecer e derrubar governos são a parte mais consistente do inventário da CIA, levantado pelo jornalista Tim Weiner, do New York Times, ganhador do Prêmio Pulitzer por suas investigações sobre os serviços secretos norte-americanos. Para escrever Legado de Cinzas, que acaba de ser publicado no Brasil, Weiner baseou-se em mais de 50 mil documentos, 2.000 depoimentos orais e 300 entrevistas. O resultado se condensa num relato demolidor de quase 800 páginas, que ele resume nesta entrevista concedida ao repórter Lucas Mendes, em Nova York.
What attracted you so much to the CIA?
In 1987, when the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan was in its 7th year, the United States, through the CIA, had been running weapons to the Mujahideen, the holy warriors of Afghanistan, through Pakistan to fight the Soviets. Very few American reporters went in to Afghanistan in those days to report on what was one of the biggest covert action programs of the Cold War. So I wanted to go and see it for myself. I was in Washington. I called up CIA. You know, you can ring them up on the telephone.
Right.
They have a public affairs office. It's the strangest job in the American government, the public affairs office of the Central Intelligence Agency. So I said to them, I understand that sometimes you will give briefings to foreign correspondents who are going to strange countries. How about it? I'm going to Afghanistan. No, they said. So I went. I had a great trip in the mountains with the Mujahideen. I came back to Washington about 3 months later, and I hadn't been back in Washington for more than a day when my telephone rang. It was the CIA. Hello, Tim. How are you? Would you like to come in for that briefing now? So I went. You walk into the CIA. It's about 7 miles outside Washington. Great, enormous lobby of marble. And on the left, as you look up, in big, big letters, is the line from the Gospel of John. And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. So I was hooked.
The CIA is 61 years old, and according to you, it has a long collection of failures. Let me just read briefly some of them. They fail to predict the Iranian Revolution of '79, the Soviet atomic bomb in '49, the invasion of South Korea in 1950, the installation of missiles in Cuba in '62, the Arab-Israeli War of '73, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. They have the wrong report on weapons of mass destructions in Iraq, and the famous slam dunk invasion, the Indian atomic bomb in '98, the Sputnik, and on and on and on. What did the CIA get right?
Several very important things. The CIA tried to tell President Johnson in 1966, in 1967, that the war in Vietnam was a political war, that it would not be won only by military might alone, that the will of the Vietnamese communists to persist was very strong. Lyndon Johnson didn't want to hear that. But the CIA kept trying to deliver that message, and that took courage, and they were right. The CIA contributed very much to the process, now largely abandoned, of arms control with the old Soviet Union, to talk with them, to try and keep the force levels of nuclear weapons down. Now, each side had tens of thousands of warheads, more than enough. to destroy the world many, many hundreds of times over. But that was important to talk because it helped to keep the Cold War cold.
Yeah.
That's important. And when the Cold War came to an end, this was during the period where George Bush, the father, was president, and Bob Gates, who is now our Secretary of Defense, was the director of CIA, and a good one. When the Cold War came to an end, they didn't go dancing on the Berlin Wall. They didn't go charging into, Latvia and Estonia and the former Soviet satellite countries waving the American flag with their guns drawn. They stayed calm. And after 45 years of struggle, in which millions of people in third countries died in the proxy wars of the Cold War, the war between the United States and the old Soviet Union ended without either side firing a shot. Yeah. These are three important successes.
That's true. What was the worst failure? Is it possible to pick one?
There's no question. I think we all remember 5 years ago when Colin Powell, then the Secretary of State, went before the United Nations. And sitting over his right shoulder was George Tenet, the Director of Central Intelligence. And Powell told the UN and the American people and the world what the CIA was saying, which was that Iraq was filled with chemical and biological weapons that threatened the world. Wrong. Dead wrong. And so we went to war. When intelligence fails, soldiers die. When intelligence fails, you get into a war that you didn't have to fight.
But do you think the CIA was forced, either by the President, the White House, to change that?
I do not.
You do not?
That is what the intelligence said. Unfortunately for all of us, that intelligence was 4, 5, 6, 7 years old.
Did the CIA fail to anticipate the Al-Qaeda attacks in the United States?
Yes, but that was a failure of the American government, not simply of the CIA. That was a failure of the FBI.
Yeah.
That was a failure of the Federal Aviation Administration, which controls airplanes. It was a failure of the Immigration and Naturalization Service. It was a failure of Washington reporters like me, and I was one for 15 years, up to the year 2000, to fully understand the threat. It was a failure of the U.S. government.
We listed the failures of the CIA, and you listed three important rights. Maybe they have some more secret successes that we are not aware. Is it possible?
I do think that if the veil were lifted and everything were revealed, would the balance of the judgments that I've made in this book change? I doubt it.
Yeah.
The problems that I'm describing in this book are not unique to the CIA. They are American problems. We don't speak foreign languages. We don't really understand foreign cultures very well. We don't know history, okay? Language, culture, and history are three important things that you need to understand when you're projecting power abroad.
And you do not have that.
I think that we are weak in those subjects, yes.
But how such an incompetent organization managed for so long to project an image of efficiency, success, competence? They were all James Bonds who could depose the government in the morning, have a martini for lunch, and a woman for dessert. How is that possible? How did they manage that?
A great deal of the image of the CIA that we Americans believe in, and I think all people throughout the world believe in, comes from the movies, and it comes from television, and it comes from novels. But that's not what it's really like.
President Kennedy loved Fleming and the James Bond's books, but he did not like the CIA. Was it because of the Bay of Pigs, the failure of the Bay of Pigs?
Imagine that you are President Kennedy.
Yeah.
You've been in office for less than 4 months. The Director of Central Intelligence, Alan Dulles, who is a legend, a man of 70, he's been around for a long time, comes to you and says, Mr. President, we have a plan to get rid of Fidel Castro. It's a slam dunk, okay? And we're going to invade Cuba with this guerrilla force of Cubans. We're going to take care of Castro for you. It's not a problem. Success, pretty much guaranteed. And the president says, are you quite sure about this? It's a slam dunk, Mr. President, in so many words, is what Allen Dulles said. And you have this disaster at the Bay of Pigs. The very phrase is synonymous with military and intelligence disaster. You're sending 1,500 Cubanos against an army, Fidel Castro's army of 60,000 people. You're sending them into a mangrove swamp. I've been in the Bay of Pigs, okay? Playa Girón, okay? It's a mangrove swamp. You can't march through this swamp to the mountains. You're going to die. And that's what happened to the CIA's Cubans at Playa Girón, at the Bay of Pigs.
Was Kennedy the first president to abuse the CIA, in the sense of use the CIA to spy on American citizens?
I think he was. And the reason we have evidence of this is that Kennedy taped himself. It didn't start with Nixon. Kennedy installed a secret taping system in the White House. He turned it on for the first time in June 1962. And what was the very first conversation that he recorded? He was talking to the American ambassador to Brazil about overthrowing the government of President Goulart.
Oh, Lincoln Gordon.
That's correct.
Yeah. It's very interesting. I just want to make a break here, getting this opportunity. Your book has two brief references about Brazil. One is that Vernon Walters was there to give support to the post, but Brazil is not in the CIA, on the CIA radar. I mean, according to your book, it's Cuba, Chile,
I know.
Noriega.
If you look at the passage that I'm describing, here's the President of the United States on tape talking about overthrowing the government of Brazil.
That's important.
In 1962. And plans were set in motion, and money flowed down to various labor groups and through the CIA station to support what became a coup. The United States spoke about promoting democracy in the Western Hemisphere during the Cold War. But what the United States was more interested in was stability in the Western Hemisphere. Promoting democracy turned out to be very messy, okay, as democracy is. It's untidy. As Donald Rumsfeld once said, stuff happens when you're trying to promote democracy in societies that are developing. And the record of fighting communism in the Western Hemisphere is not a happy one during the 50s and 60s and 70s. We supported, the United States supported military dictatorships and supported them through the CIA in the name of stability and in the name of fighting communism.
Now, George Bush, the father, according to you, was a very good CIA director and was a president who knew how to use the CIA. Why?
Well, he's the only president that we've ever had who actually ran the CIA, and it was only for 11 months, but he liked it very much.
Yeah, you have a good story that he wanted to stay there.
He did want to stay there. It was the most interesting job he'd ever had, and he'd had a lot of jobs up to that point. When the administration changed, after Jimmy Carter was elected, but before he became president, Bush had a job interview, and he wanted very much to be kept on. And I interviewed Jimmy Carter about this. And President Carter said, you know, I have often wondered what would have happened if I had kept George Bush at the CIA. He never would have become president, that's for sure. So you see, this is one of history's great what-ifs.
It's a funny story. How can a secret society like the CIA function well in an open democracy with strong powers like the executive, the judiciary, and the Congress.
We have been trying in this country now, in the United States, for 60 years to figure this very question out. How do you run a truly secret intelligence service in a truly open democracy? It's a struggle. It's a tug of war. And we haven't quite gotten it right yet. Here's another problem why we haven't gotten it right yet. We have only been at this business of espionage in this country for 60 years. Now the Russians, they've been at it for 300 years, since Peter the Great. The British have been at it for 500 years, since Queen Elizabeth I. And the Chinese have been at it for 2,600 years. We're beginners.
You said that the CIA has less than 100 prisoners in secret prisons.
As far as I know, that's true.
Are you talking about Guantanamo or other prisons?
The Director of Central Intelligence has said, and there's no evidence to contradict him, that as of a few months ago, there were fewer than 100 so-called secret prisoners under the CIA's jurisdiction. And as far as we know, there are only 14 who are really top terrorists.
But this is not Guantanamo, or he's included worldwide.
The 14, I believe, now have been transferred to Guantanamo.
Who are these 14?
There are people like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was the mastermind, the planner of the 9/11 attacks.
Now, the CIA, since the invasion, got an awful reputation, maybe not as bad as the KGB, because the KGB was being used to do things inside the country, more brutal things, but you have connections with people inside the CIA from present and the past. Do most of them support torture?
No.
No?
This is a very important point, and Americans need to understand it, and citizens of the world need to understand this. The CIA is an instrument of presidential power. It doesn't volunteer for these missions. It didn't put up its hand and say, hey, I have a really good idea. Let's build a network of secret prisons around the world. Or, hey, let's go kill Fidel Castro back in the 60s. The CIA does what the president tells it to do. But presidents won't always take responsibility for those orders. The orders to set up this global network of secret prisons, to use techniques tantamount to torture, or torture itself, they came from the White House, they came from the president.
Is it possible to fight terrorism without torture?
The war in which we're now engaged is primarily an intelligence war. It's a war of intelligence, it's a war of information, it's a war of ideas. It's not going to be won with nuclear weapons, or submarines, or smart bombs, or tanks, or torture. It's going to be won because we stand for freedom, liberty, justice, and democracy, and the terrorists don't.
But you do not know history, language, and culture, and you don't care about that, and apparently you think these are essential things for a secret organization.
I do indeed. We would be very well served in this country if we learned how to speak Arabic, if our intelligence services, our diplomats, our military men knew how to speak the language. At the end of 2006, there was a group led by the former Secretary of State James Baker and the former congressman who headed the Foreign Relations Committee, Lee Hamilton. On this group were a former Supreme Court Justice, Sandra Day O'Connor. It was a very distinguished group. They went over to Baghdad to study the situation. The group was known as the Iraq Study Group. One of the things they studied was they went to everyone in the Green Zone, in the American compound in Baghdad, thousands of military officers, diplomats, spies, support personnel. I said, how many of you speak Arabic? How many do you think Americans in the Green Zone at the end of 2006 in Baghdad spoke Arabic? 6.
6?
6.
Yeah, that's a problem.
That's a problem.
Yeah. Now, when you say, talk about the terror industrial complex, what does it mean?
Colin Powell used that phrase in retirement, in an interview. And he said, look, can the terrorists kill people? Yes, of course. Can they knock down a building? Yes, we know that. Can they change us? Can they change American political society? Can they change this country? No, they cannot. The only ones that can do that are us. Yeah. The only ones that can fundamentally harm us are us. Okay? And we shouldn't do it to ourselves. And we shouldn't use fear to keep people, Americans, terrified. And we shouldn't use it as a political weapon to get elected. And we shouldn't use it to build what he called a terror industrial complex in this country. We have to be very careful of that.
The title of your book, Legacy of Ashes, I think comes from President Eisenhower. What is the story?
It was the end of Eisenhower's presidency. Yeah. It was in the very days that he warned, President Eisenhower, a 5-star general, he warned the American people against, these were his words, the disastrous rise of misplaced power in the military-industrial complex. That's right. And President Eisenhower had a series of meetings with the members of his National Security Council that included Allen Dulles, who had served him for 8 years as Director of Central Intelligence. And the President was frustrated at the failure of the Director of Central Intelligence to coordinate all the military and civilian intelligence in the country, which was his job, and to organize it, to centralize it, to make it coherent. And the President said, I've suffered an 8-year defeat on this, and I'm going to hand my successor a legacy of ashes. And 4 months later came the Bay of Pigs.
How is the CIA today?
It is trying very hard to rebuild itself after the disastrous failures that helped lead us to war. It is growing. It is growing fast.
But it's much reduced than what it used to be?
It is reduced in power, but it is growing in size.
I see.
Today, roughly half of the spies and the intelligence analysts at CIA have less than 5 years' experience. They have been hired since 9/11. So they are learning, trying to learn the craft of intelligence.
So you have, are you still pursuing the CIA? Are you still going to keep spying on them? Or it's, for the time being, it's
After 20 years, I think it's time to turn attention to another subject, maybe the FBI.